The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 16th chapter. We're starting at verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The gospel of the Lord. Please have a seat. So one of the things I've always found helpful when reading the Bible is to listen for everything that's being said, even if it isn't actually on the page. Some might call reading this between the lines. That's fine. Whatever it's called, it's important to read this way because it's the way people write or text or message or email. It's the way people have always written. Here's what I mean. Imagine you're waiting for someone to meet you at a restaurant and you get this text. "Hey, got a flat on 168, changing tire at Arco and Ashland, see you in 20. Now that is perfectly understandable to everybody here, right? You know exactly what the situation is, you know exactly what's going on, and you know it because you and the author share a common social vocabulary. We know that highways are numbered. We know what an Arco is. And we know that 20 refers to minutes, not years or degrees. Now take that text and hide it away for 2,000 years. Deciphering those simple few words might now become almost impossible unless a person reads back into history and taps into the social vocabulary out of which it was written. Social vocabulary is something we don't think about. Social vocabulary just comes to us naturally because we speak the same language, we live in the same culture, and we live in the same close geographical part of that culture. Now, I did not know this because I'm a native Californian, but I've had people say, "How do I get to your house?" And I say, "Well, you get off the 168 at." And they go, "Oh, Californian." They go, "What do you mean?" He says, "For some reason, you Californians always refer to your highways with the definite article, the." And I thought, well, everybody does that. Apparently not. A lot of people say Highway 168 or Interstate 5 or something. That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard in my life. You just say the and save yourself the trouble. See? That's social vocabulary. Well, we do it, and the people who wrote the Bible did the exact same thing, thinking nothing about it, like we think nothing about how we use a social vocabulary among people who inhabit the same place in time and in culture as we do. So their words, in other words, come to us encoded with a lot more information than ever touches the page. And that's what a careful reading of the Bible will always try to do. Understand what isn't written necessarily, but is still informing the story the Bible writers propose to tell. Sometimes knowing this stuff will just add color and texture and just make it a little more interesting. Sometimes it's what delivers most of the message. And that's what makes reading the Bible sometimes a little more sophisticated than just opening the book and paging through it. And case in point is our story today. This is a well-known story. It appears here in Matthew and in shorter form both in Mark and Luke. It is Peter's shining moment, but this time where it happens is as important as what happens once they get there. Here's what I mean. We know the story takes place in the district of Caesarea Philippi. Why? Because the author tells us. And this is an interesting place, long associated with a variety of foreign gods. In Canaanite times, it was associated with the worship of Baal, or Baal, the Canaanite king of the gods. In the Greek period, the same place was known as Paneas because of its association with the Greek god Pan, the god of desolate places, which is apropos because this place that Jesus has taken his disciples is a desolate place located at the foot of Mount Hermon. Under Herod the Great, it was named Caesarea in honor of Herod's patron, the emperor of Rome, whose title was Caesar. And when this region came under the aegis of Herod's son Philip, as oftentimes happened when somebody took the throne, he renamed this place in honor of himself. And that's how it got the name Caesarea Philippi, the Caesarea of Philip. If this is all we knew about it, this would be a set of fun facts. Not much more. But Jesus mentions one more detail about Caesarea Philippi. He tells Peter the gates of hell will not prevail against his confession of Jesus being the Messiah, Son of the living God. Now, Jesus' term, the gates of Hades, could be a poetic turn of phrase, but here it probably refers to exactly where Jesus had this moment with his disciples. Because in Caesarea Philippi, there is a grotto to this day, out of which a spring flows to this day that feeds the Jordan River. And because of the ancient belief that caves and grottos were entrances to the underworld, here in Caesarea Philippi, the grotto was named the Gates of Hades. Exactly what Jesus says. Why is this important? It's important because it gives an unspoken but revealing context to Jesus' questions that he asks his disciples. And if this is the setting of this scene in the life of the disciples, it certainly isn't by accident. Because imagine this, carved into the walls on either side of this grotto at the foot of Mount Hermon were niches. And in these niches were placed all the different gods that people over time had come there to worship and beg favors from. And imagine now, as Jesus and his disciples are nearing the entrance to this spring, all these niches are filled with statues of all these gods kind of looking down on them. That would have been the scene that the disciples would have seen in their day. By the way, you can still go there. The water is still flowing, and you can still see these niches there. They don't have any statues in them, but all the niches are there. So, this is the backdrop then. This is the social vocabulary. This is the cultural content that everybody would have understood when they first heard the story that we sort of have to read our way into. But then it's in this context, with all these idols in their niches staring down on the disciples. It's in this context where Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" It gives a different kind of feel to that question, doesn't it? Because he's asking this question against the backdrop of a broad spectrum of gods who have, laid claim to people's allegiances down through the years. Jesus isn't simply having an intimate chat with his disciples around maybe a campfire, all by themselves. No, he's asking his disciples to identify him as the one and only God. At the convergence of many religions, at ground zero for pagan worship, under the gaze of many idols staring down from them in their various niches. The Romans' name for Mount Hermon, incidentally, was the Mountain of the Gods. Appropriate, if you ask me. So it's a fitting place for Peter to confess in the presence of all the mute and lifeless stone idols adorning the place that Jesus is the Messiah, Son of the living God. Now that is almost never used to describe Jesus. But here, Peter says, you are the Messiah, Son of the living God. In contrast to all the mute stone idols that cannot move and that cannot speak. So you see, Jesus' question is more than a simple, am I the Messiah, yes or no? What Jesus is asking his disciples is, in a place saturated with pagan worship, and at the very entrance to the dark and terrible forces of the underworld, what he's asking his disciples is, am I your one and only? This is a momentous question for the disciples, made more momentous because it's asked in a place where all the other options for their worship are on display. Each God offers different powers and promises. Each God comes with a different set of rites and rituals. Each God represents a different and defining sense of belonging. So what Jesus is really asking is, will you belong to me? Will you follow me? Will you rely on me? And I think he's still asking that question. Because we, like the first disciples, have options, right? Now, we don't believe in a pantheon per se, but we are free to worship gods or God or no God. We can worship an idea. We can worship ourselves, sometimes without even knowing it. We can worship a lifestyle that encourages us to indulge our favorite appetites. We have a pantheon too, so to speak. And Jesus is still asking for us to choose. He asks us to choose because he knows the God you choose is the God you reflect. And Jesus wants you to reflect him. I've often said we each have our own picture of Jesus. It's the compilation of a lot of things, really. The things we've heard about Jesus growing up, maybe a favorite Sunday school teacher, what we've read for ourselves in the Bible, the experiences we've had as we've grown and matured in our faith. Whoever that Jesus is the Jesus you're growing into, because that's the Jesus you're following. And that's the Jesus you'll reflect to the world. And Jesus wants you to know who that Jesus is. And that's why his question to the first disciples is his question to us right now. Who do you say that Jesus is? Who is Jesus for you? Who is Jesus with you? Who is Jesus through you? Now, if you're like most people, you probably don't have a ready answer. That's fine. Jesus' own disciples stumbled and bumbled their way through that encounter with Jesus 2,000 years ago. So if you don't have a ready answer for who Jesus is for you, to you, you're not in bad company. But I think that's something we can all be working on, because we may be asked by someone who Jesus is, who's chosen us for whatever reason to show them the way to Jesus. So what images of Jesus form your picture of him? What's the latest thing you've learned about Jesus? And how is it fitting in with what you already believe about him? Has your picture of Jesus been confirmed over time? Or has it been challenged? Does it need to change? In what ways have you experienced Jesus in your life? If you're someone who's had a profound experience of forgiveness. You might see Jesus as the forgiver of sins. That would be accurate. If you've been healed of a serious illness, maybe Jesus for you is the great healer. That would also be accurate. If you've had an experience of great loneliness, maybe Jesus for you is the one who never abandons. That would be another accurate way to understand Jesus. As you follow him, these are the things you might find yourselves emulating, right? So if forgiven, you might be forgiving. If loved, then loving. Jesus is a great many things. And we do as human beings gravitate to aspects of his identity that have special meaning for us. And we tend to reflect those same things in our Christian lives. And again, that's all good, as long as they reflect the authentic Jesus, the Jesus of the Bible. I think one of the reasons Jesus asks his disciples who he is, where he does, is to clue them into who he isn't as much as to tease out of them who he is. He isn't like the capricious and vengeful gods of the Roman pantheon or the bloodthirsty gods of the Canaanites. Is he more powerful than all the assembled forces of evil? Yes, he is. Because he says to them, you know, the mouth, the gaping maw of hell will not defeat my church, certainly. But does he win victory with violence? No. He wins victory with love, a love that's so strong it sometimes even surrenders itself. This is where Peter, right after he has this great victory, will have one of his most stunning defeats. We didn't read that part. But you know he gets into trouble just seconds after declaring Jesus accurately to be the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Because for Peter and for all Israel, the Messiah will be Israel's conquering hero. He will defeat the enemies of Israel, namely the Romans. He will kick them out. He will certainly not fall victim to these same enemies. And of course, that's where he gets in trouble. And finally, you know, Jesus has to tell him, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Oof. How'd you like to hear that from Jesus? And I think this is just testament to the fact that all of our images of Jesus, whatever they are, sometimes need adjusting. All of our perceptions of Jesus need to grow and mature. That's part of the journey of faith. We talk about the journey of faith. We don't talk about, you know, the terminus of faith. We don't talk about the getting to the end of the story kind of faith. No, we're always on a journey, always moving ever deeper into the life of God, always being conformed more and more to the likeness of Jesus. And that's why we need to live with our eyes and our ears and our hearts open to what God is doing all around us, so we can be a part of what God is doing all around us. And so we can reveal the life of God in the lives that we're living, and not just our imagination as to who Jesus is or ought to be, but accurately reflecting who the Jesus of the Bible really is. Nothing is so damaging to a well-lived faith than to think we've got it all right, that there's nothing more to learn, that there's nothing more to do. Because as long as we're drawing breath, there's always something more. So no show of hands, but how many of us here have ever spoken to anybody about our faith? How many of us have taken advantage of opportunities to express our faith in ways that are of benefit to others? Jesus calls us to a life that knows his life and follows his life and is willing, even in small ways, to live for the good of others. You know, there are a lot of gods we could worship that point us only to ourselves. Jesus isn't one of them. Jesus points us to our neighbor. And against every backdrop of every false god we could imagine, Jesus calls us to choose him, to follow him, to be like him, to live out his life in our lives. So I think the challenge of this story, and so many like it in the Bible, is to let God hold sway in your life. Let God win in your life. None of us will ever do this perfectly, that's for sure. But why let that keep you from trying? And this is why we worship every week and study the Bible all the time and spend time in dialogue with all believers to keep our pictures of Jesus clear, to keep the story straight, to be as faithful to the God of Scripture as we possibly can be. This is why we live the Word and serve others and cheer one another on. So the picture we have of Jesus shows up in ways others can detect and experience and benefit from. And this is why we take prayer seriously, because these are the gifts we've been given to see Jesus for who he truly is and to offer him honestly to the world. Look, I got to tell you, there are people in this world, you might know some of them, who claim to be Christian. Fine, I'm not accusing them of telling us a story. But if you listen to them, Jesus doesn't quite sound like the Jesus of the Bible. Jesus is maybe, instead of the one who stepped over boundaries, is the one who's creating boundaries, like there are the good people and all the other people. Or the people Jesus approves of and the people Jesus condemns. Do you know people like this? If you don't, flick on Sunday morning church. Well, not us, all of you who are, I didn't mean that. But you know what I mean, right? You know what I mean. And my heart breaks for that, because that is not Jesus of the Bible. And it's right there to read. And yet, because of our broken human powers of perception, sometimes it is the case that instead of us looking more and more like Jesus, Jesus starts to look more and more like us. And that's a problem, isn't it? You betcha. So Jesus asks again and again and again, who do you say that I am? So who do you say that he is? And by the way, Jesus isn't asking who somebody said you must believe him to be. That's not what Jesus is asking. Jesus does not want to know who Pastor Rob tells you he is. He wants to know who you believe him to be. Now, can we listen to our teachers? Yeah. Can we learn from those, maybe more learned in the faith? Of course we can. But when Jesus asks you, who do you say I am? That's exactly what he's asking. Tell me who I am to you. And of course, we have traditions, we have creeds and confessions to give us a framework of our belief system. But the picture itself, the face of Jesus that you hold in your heart, that's between God and you. All these things play a role in how we get a real picture of the Jesus of the Bible. And this is how we align ourselves to this Jesus, the Jesus of Peter's confession. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. There are so many dead gods in the world. There are so many dead ideas, dead ends. There are so many things that only want to hurt and to harm and to derail and to confuse. Jesus wants us to know the living God, his living presence in our life. Because it's only with his living presence in our life can we find the courage to live out the Jesus living in us. The real Jesus. The Jesus who is always calling you deeper and deeper and deeper into his life, deeper into his love. The Jesus who wants more than anything for you, not only to choose him as your one and only, but to become just like him. And to take your place in his ongoing ministry to help and to heal and to save.